Hey guys, welcome to book review 144. Today I am going to be reviewing Gatecrashing Paradise, Misadventures in the Real Maldives by Tom Cheshire. Alright, so as the title would imply, this book is all about the Maldives, a little known island nation off the southwest coast of India. And there's only about 400,000 people in the whole country. And for most of its modern history, it's been sort of a hermit kingdom. Outsiders were allowed, but only to areas of all-inclusive resorts where you pretty much stay on the resort and you don't go off the resort. And that was both for the patrons as well as, to keep them from seeing the rest of the people of the Maldives, as well as the people of the Maldives themselves being unduly influenced by the hedonistic Westerners. The Maldives is an Islamic country. They do practice Sharia law. You can get alcoholic beverages on the resorts, but outside of that, there is no alcohol in the country. You hear the call to prayer. There are mosques in the various communities. Something else just very early on that'll strike you about the Maldives is how flat it is and how small the islands are. So some island nations or island territories like Hawaii are known as high islands. These are islands that have some sort of uplift, either from volcano or some sort of mountainous ridge that has now mostly been submerged except for the areas above water. But what the Maldives is it's all low islands. And what this is a series of mountain chains that became completely submerged. But then over time, islands emerged by coral reefs being close enough to the surface, and then being born, living, dying, sand, turning into sand. And this sand eventually crested the waves in a 500-mile span from north to south. The Maldives is like a long, skinny archipelago chain of these islands. Now, to really emphasize this point, the highest natural point of land in the whole country is 9 meters above sea level, which obviously tells you that it's very flat. This also brings me into the point of global warming and how this could be an island nation that essentially becomes extinct. Something that Tom saw on his journey was sort of a combination of worry, but also kind of a head in the sand mentality of people were much more worried about their daily lives and were obviously worried in the long term about what would happen to their island, but were not necessarily hitting the emergency button like you think they might when this happened. The counterexample to this, of course, is when the 2000, I believe it was 4, tsunami of the Indian Ocean that started off the coast of Sumatra and spread all over the Indian Ocean hit the Maldives. Now, because of something interesting about coral atolls, or as I mentioned, like the coral that goes above the sand, they tend to have protective reef barriers, but those can be mixed. In some areas of the Maldives, there was almost no effect of this tsunami wave that came in and hit the islands. In other areas, such as, this is when I get to the map here, Villa Fishy, I believe that's right, it became almost completely inundated with water from the waves, and there had to be huge Red Cross as well as other humanitarian effort come in to rebuild the community. But something about this book specifically, I've kind of talked about the generalities of the Maldives now, is that Tom, outside of the very end of the book, tries to, as the book would say, misadventures in the real Maldives He learns about the people, learns about the culture, rather than, and part of it is monetary wise, obviously, him not being a wealthy Russian oligarch that wanted some sea and sun in the Maldives. He took the back roads or the back waterways, if you will. He traveled around with the local people. Often these would be on, like commercial, why can I not think of the word, boats that would transport goods, and then as a side service transported people around these islands. And often he said that he had tremendous food on these boats. Something about the Maldives is it does have the influence from India. There is a lot of curries. Something that was mentioned throughout the book numerous times was tuna curry. Obviously fish being very big in the Maldives. He also mentioned a certain type, I think it was a certain type of breadfruit that he really liked that was part of their culture. So he starts off his journey in Mali, not the M-A-L-E, not M-A-L-I, like the country, but this is the capital of the Maldives, and I'll get back to that in a second. But he kind of goes to the airport and then immediately goes south to the Aru Atoll. Now, the primary thing about this atoll is that it was politically separated, or it's still part of the nation of the Maldives, but in terms of mentality, is separated from the rest of the Maldives, from the power source in Mali, and for a time period actually had a semi-independent government that was somewhat recognized specifically by the British because they had influence in the area. The other thing about this far south region is that they did have a British base there, and there was been a lot of complaints since the British left and actually moved south to Diego Garcia as part of an American expansion plan there, that the economy has essentially tanked, that it is, it's always a little bit of a backwater, but that there was influence from the British military base there, and contrary to belief of a lot of anti-expansionist people, it actually benefited the community quite a bit. And for example, the community had consistent electricity generation when the British Royal Air Force was there, but when they left, now it's only just by generators and only at certain times of night. Obviously, there was a big trade between the military, just the soldiers kind of on leave or whatever, and the locals. But that's kind of all fallen off since the British moved their base. That being said, let's see if I can't get to the specific page. Tom finds a lot of the old stuff quite fascinating. The old military barracks there has been turned into a hostel or a hotel, or really a guest house, that a lot of the ex-military actually go back, and that is a big source of tourist income on the island, is ex-military people going back and seeing their old place. There only being two, the Shangri-La Hotel and the Heathrow Resort area that Tom spends time in, or that doesn't spend time in, because he essentially doesn't have the money and the connections, though he will spend time on these resorts later. Secondly, he moves to the Middle Islands. Well, what are the Middle Islands? Those are Lamu and Tha Atoll. In Lamu, I am sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, the highest point in the country exists, but what it is it's a, I believe, a mound artificially created to honor the Buddhist tradition. Now, I previously said that this is a Muslim country, but the Buddhist influence, and I think the Hindu influence too, came from the mainland of India, and then it was only in, I think, like the 1100s or so that there was, they all converted to Islam. Let's see, he later goes, I'll just go ahead and say this, he later goes to the Six Senses Resort there, where he has wine and is pampered, and it's really nice, and uses one of those cigarette boats to jet right out to the resort, and is secluded from any sort of tarnish or malady that could ever exist in such a beautiful, wondrous place. Let's see. The second atoll he goes to is the Tha Atoll. I already talked about some of the boats being or some of the how that area was inundated with water. He goes out and I think he sees Bruni, which is like this really, really isolated place out in the middle of nowhere, which is kind of par for the course. Next, he moves up north. I thought the northern area was really interesting because, again, he saw some really unique places. He talks more about the politics there. The Maldives, okay, I'm going to totally butcher the names, but Nasir was the president from Britain, or the Maldives was never, I'm going to get this right, the Maldives was only colonized once, and that was by the Portuguese in the 14 or 1500s, I believe. And it was only for about a 10-year time period, at which point they were kicked out. But not having the defense forces that they had, but still wanting to internally remain independent, the Maldives became a protectorate of the British Raj, British India. But Britain completely stayed out of their internal affairs, and they essentially just said, we'll deal with the outside world, and nobody else attack these people or deal with them at all. So they were essentially a hermit kingdom. In the mid-1960s, the Maldives became independent. Nasir, who was kind of a mixed president, was the president for the first 10 years. There were charges of corruption, and he was essentially kicked out. The corruption was kind of bad, but it wasn't nothing to what was to come next, which is Gayoom. Gayoom, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, was a dictator. He did not allow dissent. Maybe his methods were not nearly as bad just because it was a small country as, say, like the gulags of Russia or something like that. But he did torture his people. That's been known. He did manipulate. He probably murdered. I don't think there were any mentions. No, there were mentions of that in the book. There was a huge prison riot, and the guards just killed all the people that engaged in the riot. But because of this riot, there was a kind of a swell, the individual prison riot, there was a swell of revolution, or at least a change, wanting of a change of power. And that's when Hassan became the president as part of the Maldives Democratic League, I believe, or Maldives Democratic Party, which had a lot of progress, but at the time of this writing, Gayoom was no longer president. He had been kicked out, but he had kicked Hassan out and put his own sort of lackey in place to kind of run the country. And that's kind of where they are in the book. Of course, actually it does mention in the book that there were a couple times where there was kind of dissent on the resorts themselves, specifically an instance where somebody was married and the person that was the native person from the Maldives that was doing the ceremony swore at them and had all these negative words in the language of the Maldives that starts with a D, Dasham or something. But of course they didn't know, and it was only later revealed, and then there was the big, a whole bunch of people were fired and everything. But there's been no sort of risk of violence on the resorts, but kind of inevitably the economics, or the politics, and specifically the economics of the resorts plays big into politics. Another thing why Gayoom was heavily criticized was because there were native Maldives that were working on the resorts. They knew that there were taxes of the resorts, but the government was very opaque in where these taxes were going, and it was thought that a large amount of it was winding up with the lackeys of Gayoom and eventually finding his way, and he was enriching himself. It is such a small country, the Maldives, that Tom was actually able to meet with Gaum, and they had kind of a terse conversation where Tom was able to insinuate a few things, but obviously didn't want to rock the boat too much. I mean, any other country that has even a semi-dictator like Gaum was, he wasn't a true dictator, but it was pretty close. The elections were more or less rigged until the people stood up against him. You couldn't meet the leader of the country, but he just basically called 2 or 3 people and kind of made some connections and then met the whole ex-president of the country. But anyway, they talk about politics up north. They go to Hanamanahu. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. There's a couple things that happen up north. There's the hero. The hero was the one that kicked out the Portuguese. I mentioned that the Portuguese ruled for 10 years. He kicked them out, became a hero of the country, yada, yada, yada. He had some brother, and there was infighting after he kicked that person out, but was still considered a hero because the Portuguese, they're gone. What else did Tom see up north? That was his native homeland, was the Half Alafu Atoll, which I'm butchering that to the 9th degree. They also went to an island where the United Nations had set up a climate change observatory. This is one of a whole handful across the world. Really, the data processing didn't take place on this island. It was more just like a data collecting area, and then all of the data was then sent back to the UN headquarters. But they did mention a physicist there that kind of showed them around and showed, I mean, there was high-tech equipment there, obviously, because they needed to be able to collect all of this data on the atmosphere and global warming and temperatures and all those kinds of things. So we saw that. That was pretty cool. It was kind of cool because, oh yeah, they also, there was a big observatory. Well, it wasn't an observatory, but it was like a big, tall, cylindrical collecting mechanism that went high above the trees. One of the few tall structures outside of Mali that existed in the country. And Tom said it was really cool because he could get a perspective of the canopy of these low-lying islands, but could also see the amazing shades of blue in the lagoons and areas around this atoll. They also go to Makanuho. Wow, I'm just butchering these. But that was essentially a prison island. It's an island that is somewhat geographically separated even from the northern islands, and has a reef that tears boats to shreds unless you specifically know what you're doing. And even the captain of the ferry that was taking them to these islands was quite afraid that he was going to crash his boat. Let's see. Banishment Island, yeah, that's what they call that's the English name for it. Talked to some resort workers up north. It goes back to Mali. I've already talked a lot about the politics there. Mali, because I talked about how the country might be inundated, kind of referencing things I've already talked about, is building its island Hul Hamle, which actually used to be an area where the reefs did not break the surface of the ocean, but was fairly close to the surface of the ocean. They're building this huge artificial island that's all raised over, I think, 3 or 4 meters above sea level. So it's essentially known as Emergency Island, is its English name. And it's the area where everyone's going to go to when the Mali gets inundated with water. But what it's essentially become is it's become a sort of like the commuter territory of Mali. Mali being one of, unlike the other islands of the Maldives, one of the most crowded areas, metropolitan areas on Earth. It's not big in terms of total populace, but the island is so small and it houses, I think, like 50% of the population of the country, that it really feels like a Manhattan in an area that's, I don't know, a couple miles long or whatever. So it's quite interesting. Let's see, they go to Vinagali, which I believe is, talk about the former dictator, coconut beaches and slippers. Okay. Yeah, I think that one might have had to do with something with politics. But part five, that's Rubbish Island. He definitely contrasts the wealth of these resort areas at the end with the Rubbish Island, where some of the poorest people in the mall in Mali took the trash of these resorts and essentially picked through it in order to find valuables. Really, it's kind of sad. But he said that the government is aware of this and trying to create a more even keel trash collection so that these resorts just aren't dumping trash everywhere. Tom did go a little bit ballin' at the end, went to the resorts, chilled out, drank the, fruity drink, kind of, they were talking about a bicycle and, like an infinity to ride around the resort on, and an infinity pool, and the beautiful sunsets and the meals that were created, and it's pretty envious worthy if you want to a degree, stick your head in the sand, but you gotta enjoy yourself from time to time. So, I've been going on way too long. Gatecrashing Paradise, Misadventures in the Maldives by Tom Chesshyre. Check it out. I don't think I really quite covered enough about the people that he met. I did more an overview of the Maldives. He said that the people are very nice. He stayed in guest houses. The food was delicious. And he really felt that outside of, the resorts were nice, but he really felt he had a more authentic experience by going to these guest houses. Okay, real quick. The guest houses had just opened up within the last year or two to promote tourism beyond just these big resorts in order to stimulate the economy more for the people instead of just for the resort owners. Okay, so Gatecrashing Paradise, Misadventures in the Maldives by Tom Chesshyre. Check out, you guys.